Dakota Territory, 1886. While most homesteaders raced the shortening days to stack logs and seal cracks before winter arrived, one Norwegian immigrant did something that made his neighbors stop, stare, and laugh. He finished his cabin early, then started building it all over again, this time 12 inches away from the first wall. They watched him set cedar pickets in a perfect rectangle around his log cabin, shaking their heads as he measured and remeasured, driving stakes into prairie soil hardened by sun and wind. To them, it looked like a fence wrapped around a perfectly good house. A waste of lumber. A sign that the newcomer didn't understand how things were done on the plains. The man's name was Olson. He had arrived in late spring with 2 trunks, a crosscut saw, and a quiet certainty shaped by winters far harsher than most of his neighbors remembered. Back in Norway, along the coast where wind cut through valleys like a blade, Olson had learned early that cold was rarely the real enemy. Wind was. Moving air that stole heat faster than any fire could replace it. His father had built fish drying sheds with double planking and dead air spaces. As a young man, Olson had worked summers at the Bergen Ice House, packing sawdust between walls to keep winter ice frozen through July heat. Now on the open plains where nothing stopped the wind for 1,000 miles, he planned to use the same ideas only in reverse. By late June, Olson's log cabin stood complete. 14 by 18 feet, 9-foot walls, chinking tight and clean. The neighbors nodded approval. That should have been the end of it. But instead of breaking sod or setting fence posts, Olson began building outward. 12 inches from his logs, he placed vertical pickets, 36 inches apart, checking each one with a plumb bob. When the road overseer, a man named Harwick who'd been on the plains since 1878, rode up and asked what in creation he was building, Olson answered simply, "Storm wall." Harwick spat tobacco juice and laughed. "That's a fence around a house," he said, "west of good lumber." Olson kept working. He cut ledger blocks from 2 by 4 stock and nailed them between the pickets to keep the frame true. At the base, he left a 3/4-inch gap for drainage and screened it with woven wire. The framework alone took 4 days of careful labor, and by then the whole township was talking. Some mocked him openly. Others watched in silence, unsure whether they were seeing foolish excess or something unfamiliar and unsettling. The outer skin went up in vertical rough, sawn boards ordered special from the Jamestown mill. Olson ran them floor to eave and battened every seam. At the roofline, he built a small overhang and flashed it with tin to shed meltwater away from the cavity. Under the eaves, he left narrow vent slots. When the schoolteacher, Martha Brennan, rode past in early August, she slowed her horse and watched him work. "Looks like a stockade," she said, curiosity edging her voice. Olson explained the idea of dead air. How moving air steals heat, how trapped air holds it. He didn't just learn this from ice houses. At the general store, a Lakota woman who traded Soon goods had once described tippy liners to him, inner cloth walls that calmed drafts and trapped warmth. Olson listened carefully. He saw the same principle hiding in plain sight, an outer skin to face the wind, an inner wall for living, still air between them. Through late summer, while his neighbors cut firewood, Olson cut prairie hay and gathered moss from creek bottoms. He dried everything carefully, knowing moisture would ruin the system. He calculated roughly 120 cubic feet of fill material and wanted it light, loose, and dry as paper. The mockery continued. They told him it would rot, that mice would nest in it, that ice houses used sawdust, not hay. Olson agreed. Sawdust was better, but hay was what he had. By October, the laughter had turned into certainty that Olson would regret his stubbornness. He filled the cavity carefully, tamping the material just enough to keep it from settling. At the top, he tacked muslin to prevent cold spots. Around doors and windows, he built hind outer shutters that sealed tight against weather. The work took 2 months, 6 weeks longer than anyone else needed to finish a cabin. When the first snow dusted the ground and Olson was still adjusting vents, his neighbors were sure winter would prove them right. What they didn't understand was that a blizzard wasn't just cold. It was pressure, wind-driven infiltration that turned single-wall cabins into bellows. The first test came on October 15th. 3 feet of snow fell in 18 hours. Wind screamed across the prairie at 35 miles an hour. Inside standard cabins, water froze solid within feet of stoves. Families burned through their wood and still woke to sub-zero interiors. Harwick woke to ice an inch thick in his water pail. Frost coated his walls. Martha Brennan's stove went cold overnight. Ice formed on her logs where her breath met frozen wood. The midwife, Sarah McKenna, found families huddled together, burning furniture, children shivering under quilts. The wind pumped heat out faster than fires could replace it. At Olson's cabin, the outer wall took the punishment. Wind slammed into the planks, but inside the cavity, the air barely moved. The fibrous fill trapped countless tiny pockets of stillness. The log wall sat protected, calm. Olson banked his fire like everyone else. In the morning, he still had coals. His water didn't freeze. By the third day, the difference was impossible to ignore. Olson began recording temperatures at dawn. Outside the outer wall, 14 below zero. Inside, 7 above. A 21-degree difference. Day after day, the numbers held. Harwick trudged through knee-deep snow expecting to find a trick. Instead, he found Olson splitting kindling in shirt sleeves. Olson showed him a simple test, pipe smoke bending violently at the outer wall, barely stirring inside. The storm lasted 7 days. On the 8th, Martha Brennan brought her own thermometer. She measured. She wrote everything down. The numbers confirmed what everyone felt. Olson used 40% less wood to maintain livable temperatures. His cabin didn't fight the wind. It ignored it. The second storm arrived in November, worse than the first. Temperatures plunged to 38 below. Families began arriving at Olson's door. He opened it without hesitation. 11 people crowded into his small cabin. He added muslin baffles to create an airlock at the door. Smoke barely moved. Water stayed liquid. Children stopped shivering. The grandfather at the Morrison place breathed easier for the first time in weeks. During the storm, Olson taught emergency retrofits. Stake boards off the windward side. Stuff the gap with straw. Hang blankets inside. Crude but effective. Within days, interior temperatures rose. Frost stopped forming. The baby at the Johansson place recovered. By spring, the laughter was gone. Men came with notebooks and tape measures. Martha Brennan included the method in her reports. Lumber orders went out. Double walls began appearing across the township. Variations followed: sawdust instead of hay, wider cavities, vestibules at doors. The physics held every time. Fuel consumption dropped. Smoke problems decreased. Children stayed healthy. Elderly survived winters that would have killed them before. What began as ridicule turned into quiet adoption, then into standard practice. The method spread through letters, bulletins, and observation. It didn't need speeches or validation. It worked. On the open plains where wind tested every weakness, Olson's second wall did something no fire could do alone. It stopped motion. It created stillness, and in that stillness, warmth endured. By the winter of 1887, the change was visible even from the road. Where once there had been lone log cabins standing naked against the wind, there were now structures wrapped in outer skins of plank canvas, or board and batten, each one separated from the living wall by a deliberate band of space. The prairie hadn't grown gentler. The wind hadn't learned mercy. What had changed was how people met it. Men who once believed heat came only from burning more wood now understood that heat could also be protected, guarded, slowed in its escape. The lesson wasn't abstract. It had been learned with numb fingers, frozen water pails, and the sound of children crying through the night. Harwick rebuilt his cabin that summer, tearing off one side at a time so his family could still sleep inside. He chose a 14-inch cavity, wider than Olson's original design, reasoning that more still air could only help. He used sawdust hauled from Jamestown, packing it carefully and leaving vent slots exactly where Olson advised. The following winter, his ledger showed numbers he would not have believed 2 years earlier. Nights that once required constant tending of the stove now passed with coals still glowing at dawn. His wife stopped waking with headaches from smoke and cold stress. Their youngest son, who had always coughed through winter, slept without wheezing. Martha Brennan convinced the territorial school board to allow her to retrofit the one-room schoolhouse using the same principles. She and her older students built an outer shell on the north and west walls, filling the gap with straw and burlap sacks. That winter, attendance rose. Children no longer stayed home with frostbitten fingers or illnesses brought on by cold classrooms. The stove burned less, the room stayed warmer, and the chalk no longer snapped in her hands from freezing overnight. She documented everything, sending careful notes to offices far beyond their township, where clerks who had never felt prairie wind read about dead air as if it were an abstract concept rather than a life-saving one. The midwife, Sarah McKenna, began advising expectant families to build temporary wind walls before winter, even if they couldn't afford a full double shell. She had seen too many infants struggle in air that never warmed. With even crude outer screens and straw-filled gaps, babies survived cold spells that had once been deadly. She noticed patterns others missed: fewer frostbitten toes, fewer lingering coughs, less exhaustion etched into faces by February. Warmth didn't just preserve comfort, it preserved strength. By the end of the decade, the method had names. Some called it storm sheathing, Others called it the Norwegian Wall. A few simply called it common sense learned the hard way. Agricultural bulletins began describing it as dead air insulation, borrowing language from ice storage manuals. Diagrams appeared showing cavities, venting, and fill density. The drawings looked neat and orderly on paper, but those who truly understood them remembered the sound of wind screaming against plank while the air inside stayed quiet. Olson himself never sought credit. He kept improving his own cabin, replacing hay with sawdust when he could afford it, widening his vestibule, refining seals. He repaired the outer skin after storms, accepting that it would always take the damage meant for the wall behind it. He understood that sacrifice was part of the design. Let the outer layer suffer. Let the inner remain calm. When newcomers arrived asking why his house looked different, he told them stories instead of theories. He spoke of ice lasting through summer when packed in sawdust, of tents made warm not by fire alone but by cloth that stilled the wind, of how cold could be endured, but motion could not. Some listened, some didn't. Winter would decide which lessons stayed. Years later, men would build houses with cavities filled by manufactured insulation, measured by numbers and codes. They would speak of R values and thermal resistance, of vapor barriers and infiltration rates. Few would remember that the core idea had once been proven by a man with hay, moss, and the patience to ignore laughter. But on the plains where wind still roared unchecked, the knowledge lingered quietly in old buildings and handed-down habits, boards set a little farther out, gaps left on purpose, air trapped and stilled. And every winter, when the storms returned without warning, the cabins that remembered the lesson stood warmer than those that did not. What began as a gesture of ridicule, a second wall no one asked for, quietly rewrote how survival was understood on the open plains. The winters did not grow softer, and the wind never learned restraint. What changed was human response. The difference between misery and endurance, between sickness and health, between burning through the last chair leg and waking to warm embers, came down to an invisible thing most had ignored: stillness. Dead air. Calm held in place by intention rather than force. Olson's cabin proved that resilience did not always require strength or excess heat, but understanding. That wisdom could travel, from ice houses to tipis, from coastlines to prairies, and still hold true when adapted with care. The latter that once followed his work faded into notebooks, measurements, and imitation, not because he argued, but because winter answered for him. In the end, no monument marked the change. There was only warmth where cold had ruled, children sleeping through the night, elders living to see spring, and homes that no longer surrendered their heat to the wind. The second wall never sought attention. It simply did its job quietly, relentlessly, proving that sometimes the smartest defense is not more fire, but less motion.